Hi everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Myri and I'd just like to welcome you to Lighthouse for tonight's launch of Life in Spite of Everything. At the end of the event we have a slightly interactive component that will be explained to you. Engage as much as you feel comfortable. Feel free to pass along the book if you're feeling a little bit shy. And the only other thing I'm going to mention is that there will be a crowdfunder mentioned at the end and then a wee slip, and we have some Ukraine solidarity posters, and if you would like to add to the crowdfunder, you will get a poster with your donation, whatever you feel comfortable giving, and then we will transfer that.
Hi everyone, I'm gonna start with a very improvised introduction. We didn't really plan this out before, so do forgive me if I say things wrong way. But I'm Vlada Vazheyevskyy. I'm a Ukrainian researcher and part of the Dvika collective. The other half is sitting right there, second row, and with whom we published Queer Ukraine, an anthology of Ukrainian queer voices during wartime. Back in February 2023, and yeah, we're working on a second one now, so hopefully that's going to come out sometime soon. We'll keep you updated, but I'm here today with Victoria Donovan, a wonderful activist, writer, and an academic who is the director of the Center for Global Socialism at St. Andrews, the professor of Ukrainian Studies, and the author of this wonderful book that we're going to talk to you about today. So I don't know if you want to mention anything else, but I think that was concise. Okay, I think to begin with, we maybe wanted to start with a question. What do you think of when we say Donbas? Anyone's welcome to answer, but that would be lovely. Anyone else?
Industry.
Industry. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd say part of Ukraine and also further part of mortality. Russian noise.
That's a good one. Maybe we can start with that. Could maybe tell us why, Donbas is such a prevalent part of the work, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Donbas, but also the very word itself is very misused sometimes or misunderstood even, so it would be great to hear from you, like, why that is important for you to keep in here, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks Vlada. Thanks everybody. Thanks for being here with me to celebrate this book, and also congratulations to this bookshop, which is 8 years old today, we just learned. Yeah, so Donbas, I learned from people who come from that region is a term that has a lot of baggage, and it has a lot of associations that people don't always know about. So it's a term actually that is first and foremost a geological term. It's a shortening of the Donetsk coal basin, Donbas, Donetsk basin. And it was first used in the kind of mid-19th century by foreign industrialists who were invited to go to that region to kind of survey the territory and the valuable minerals that lay beneath the ground that we're hearing a lot about now as well in connection with Trump's mineral deal. And to kind of understand it, and they were the ones who understood the region for the first time in terms of its resources. So they were that introduction of the term Donbas, which comes with these foreign geologists visiting in the kind of 1850s, 1860s, is part of the transformation of this region from steppe, which at that time for the Imperial Centre didn't have a particular strategic importance, into an extraction resource. And for that reason, lots of eco-critical scholars have been quite sort of critical of the term, and suggested that it reduces this region, which is so much more than its kind of resources, that has so much more kind of history and culture and complex kind of entanglements than just a history of industrialization. It reduces it to just the idea of extractivism and profit making. So that's one reason why Donbas is a bit of a problematic term. Another reason is because it was so instrumentalized in the Soviet period. So Donbas became this kind of idea, this sort of flagship of Soviet proletarian labor, and it was really heavily fetishized in Soviet propaganda. So just to give an example, there's one kind of outstanding propaganda poster from 1930 that depicts Donbas as a beating heart, pumping its lifeblood in the form of coal around the whole of what was the Russian Empire and what was becoming the Soviet Union, and sort of feeding all of these cities from Vladivostok in the east of Russia to Riga and Baku in the south of, in the Caucasus, feeding them coal and kind of driving this industrial economy. And that idea of Donbas as a kind of integral cog in a broader system or a vital organ in a bigger political body is one that pertains throughout the Soviet period, and is one that kind of still informs the Putinist imaginary of this region as something kind of integral. So that sort of idea of Donbas is this sort of this very iconic industrial land, and the idea of industrial laborers who came from that region as being the poster boys and girls of Soviet propaganda, these kind of overproducing miners and steel workers who exceeded their quota by 40 times. That also is part of the kind of heavy baggage that term carries. And then the third moment, which I think is important to underline, is that after 2014, when in retaliation for the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan uprising, that happened, that overturned the pro-Russian president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, and Russia annexed Crimea and began its war in eastern Ukraine, that term also was toxified by the way in which it was used by Russian fighting groups and pro-Russian fighting organizations in that region. It was incorporated into a lot of propaganda. It was used in kind of military terminology, and so in that way it was also associated with anti-Ukrainian hate and these sorts of toxic ideas of the Russian world. So I think those three moments are important to understand why that term is so difficult and why it's rejected by so many Ukrainian people today. But also, that said, it also means home for a lot of people, and people do still use it, and it has this domestic meaning which is sort of sits apart as well from all of that political kind of heaviness. And so it's a complex term, and one that really needs to be handled with care.
Yeah, care I think is a really big word, and just in general a very important one within this book, because I mean you can talk maybe about it later a little bit about careful writing and just, you know, kind of working with certain communities as a scholar, as a researcher with care. I think that's very important to mention later on, but I think now we can transition into the first aspect why I think you should all read this book. There's many. We're going to focus on just a few, unfortunately, for time constraints, but as a person who kind of really likes to think across struggles and to think of like inter-imperiality, just the ways that different empires, you know, collaborate and you know, feed each other. I think one thing you do really, really wonderfully well is show precisely how the Russian Empire was collaborating on this project of settler colonialism in Donbas with other empires, be it the British Empire, which makes us all living here complicit in what's happening now, just by the way, or whether it be Belgium or other big superpowers that were coming up in the 19th and 20th centuries still. So it would be really great to hear a little bit about kind of how this was developing in what is the Donbas, because I think it set the tone for a lot of the language and a lot of the kind of geopolitical discourse we're hearing now, particularly about like resource extraction from the region. It's, as this book makes evident, extremely like historic almost, you know, it's not a contemporary occurrence. So it would be really great to hear about it, and maybe if I can feed the questioning here, I think it starts this discussion really well. So how then did settler colonialism in the Ukrainian East give way to the slow violence of industrial extraction? How did the territory known variously as the Wild Field come to be reimagined once more as Donbas? So if you can just kind of tell us a little bit about that, that would be lovely.
Yeah, thanks. This is actually takes me to the very start of the research on this topic back in 2016. So I'm originally from Cardiff in South Wales, and I found out about this archive in Cardiff called the Hughesovka Research Archive. And the archive held the family documents of people who had travelled from South Wales to eastern Ukraine, today's Donbas, at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, up until 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened and they were thrown out. And basically the story is part of, so they travelled because South Wales at that time was already quite sort of industrially developed, and the Russian Tsar at that point in time made fiscal changes to invite foreign industrialists to come and relocate their companies to all sorts of territories of what was then the Russian Empire. But industrialists, capitalists were particularly interested in Donbas because it was so rich in minerals. And again, we're hearing about this a lot now, but we're hearing about a different set of minerals now. Back then, the minerals people were interested in particular were the coals. Donbas has 3 different types of coal: iron ores, salts, gypsum, and chalk. And so the Welsh at this point in time went to the area around the Luhansk and Lysychansk regions, and they were involved in the kind of the metallurgy enterprises there, and they settled, and they brought a lot of technological equipment, industrial technology with them. There's an incredible photograph in that archive of an oxen train pulling a boiler across the steppe to Donbas, which is a really remarkable thing to think about. It was being pulled from the UK, and a lot of that technology was imported and then used to kind of develop these extractivist industries in eastern Ukraine. And in that archive, you get this really sort of bizarre picture of life that was going on there. So the British people were trying to recreate the trappings of their lives back at home, and often very frustrated that they couldn't. They were trying to establish tea circles and amateur dramatics clubs. They wanted, there's this long letter I could get into that really complained about how you couldn't get good tea. But this is part of the project of settler colonialism that you're talking about. It was this kind of entangled imperiality that was the Russian Empire kind of collaborating with the British Empire at the time, which had this industrial expertise to extract its valuable minerals in order to generate profit for both centres. So the British there collaborated and partnered with Russian capitalist elites so that both sides would benefit from the minerals that were extracted, but who didn't benefit was the people who lived in that region at that time. Many of the indigenous communities that were displaced as a consequence of industry being developed at this time. So the Welsh were there, and it's like a totally bizarre story, which I didn't know about at all when I found out about this archive in 2016. We don't get taught about that in school in Wales. We get taught about how the Welsh went to Patagonia and shared their culture and how there are Welsh speakers in Patagonia, but we don't get taught about how kind of Welsh industrialists were involved in this project of extractivist colonialism in Eastern Europe. So I got totally fascinated with that and with this really incredible archive with all of these bizarre documents in it. But then it turned out that this was part of a much bigger story of foreign capitalist investment and exploitation in Eastern Ukraine. So it wasn't just the Welsh and the British who were there. There was so much Belgian capital in that region at the time that it was referred to as the 10th Belgian province. There was a lot of French capital there and industrial expertise, so-called. And also, even there were Americans there, so some American, actually they're part of the Kennedy family, but it's really unclear to me if they were those Kennedys, shipped a pipe making factory from Seattle to Mariupol and established one of the metallurgy works in Mariupol. So there was a lot of foreign capital, foreign labour and foreign technology that was moved across, huge amounts of land in order to contribute to this extractivist project. And I think that's really important to understand, partly because right now, because understandably this region is trying to distance itself from this toxic Russian world narrative. Sometimes that history of Western European industrial development gets romanticized and talked about as this sort of European heritage that ties the region to Europe rather than tying it to the Russian Empire. But those kinds of extractivist colonial practices are entangled and entwined and can't really be seen as good and bad. They're part of the same process of trying to generate capital through the extraction of resources.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dwell on this too much maybe, but there's a few really important bits that come with this. I think you talk a bit, like not in full detail, I think the book as such doesn't allow you to, but there were quite a few workers' strikes and uprisings in a way, like surrounding this kind of foreign investment firms. So that's also a very interesting kind of history, which I think we can really tap into more. And particularly now, it's very interesting, as we don't have access to many of the temporarily occupied territories, which are in the Donbas, Mariupol, and the like. It's interesting how, if that's still the occurrence, or probably not, or maybe we're just not getting that information. But it's interesting that there is a continuity there as well. And I think your book is really good at really showing those little acts of resistance, and not so little acts of resistance actually, to whether it be foreign investment or Russian colonialism. But in a way, to move from this, I think what this does really well, the second aspect why I really enjoyed this book, there's many, but is kind of how you make visible both the erasures, but also the resistances of this kind of, and the persistence of this grammar of everyday life. You go through so many places within this book with so many people. Their voices are very much present throughout, but also it's the little things that you make visible, which are usually left out of this kind of discussion of, the Russian war in Ukraine, or Russian colonialism, or just in general the Ukrainian East. And I think it would be really great to hear a little bit about both how you got to this point of writing about it, like how it came about, but also just about maybe your favorite bits and pieces of the persistence of this grammar of everyday life from the many different cities and villages which you were in.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, I was really privileged to travel in this region before the full-scale invasion. So most of my travelling was done between 2019 and 2021. So I visited Mariupol in November 2021, and that was the last time I was there, and the full-scale invasion obviously happened in February 2022. But it was really important for me, I think, collaborative processes, which I've kind of talked about and written about elsewhere, were always really important for me in terms of doing research. So I didn't want to be one of those researchers who went to a place, kind of extracted knowledge from local people, took, sort of the documents that I needed from libraries and archives, and then went back to my privileged university and wrote that up and build all of the benefits that entailed. That seemed to me to be sort of replicating the extractivist practices that, we're talking about, that kind of take minerals and resources and make a lot of money from them and don't get anything back. So I was trying to think about a way to do research differently that is kind of can have sort of benefits for lots of different people who are involved in the research process. And so I ran together with Ukrainian collaborators quite a lot of projects in the region from about 2017 onwards. And those projects were partly research projects, but they were also projects that were trying to kind of work with kind of different people in different sectors: artists, heritage workers, museum workers, cultural managers, activists, and kind of bring people together and learn from each other in various ways. So we did, for example, 2 summer schools, one in Severodonetsk and one in Bakhmut. We ran a project with a really sort of wide-ranging sort of public engagement program, which was mostly done by the Centre for Urban History in Lviv, who are really brilliant at working in this very engaged and collaborative way with local communities. We did like film screenings and exhibitions and a lot of work which engaged and included local communities. And as a consequence of doing this work over quite a long period of time, I built like quite a strong network of relationships of trust with people. And also I loved working with artists. That was like a real revelation for me, how like it totally enriched and nourished the research process to work with artists. And so I began to do projects which had various kinds of outputs to them, some more recognisably academic and some more creative and some more curatorial. And as a consequence of doing work in that way, rather than doing it in this traditionally extractivist academic way, after a couple of years, I had this kind of amazing community of people who I knew in the region, and who kind of knew what I was doing and were also involved kind of in my research and had read it and commented on it and edited it sometimes. And so that kind of created this situation where when I visited, I had like a group of people who would put me in touch with other people, and their vouching for me meant that people would open up and show you things that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily show you otherwise, these kind of secret sort of spots, and like the kinds of slightly underground practices that people are involved with and were really important in that region, but researchers didn't necessarily always get to see. And so I think that's in a sense how I came to be able to document some of that. Maybe I could read something and kind of give you a sense of the type of thing I'm talking about.
That would be lovely.
So I wanted to read a section from a chapter about Severodonetsk, which is one of the cities now occupied, now destroyed, but one of the cities where we did one of the summer schools in 2019, and it was a really beautiful summer school. Severodonetsk was just an incredible place to explore together with artists and people who work in various kinds of heritage organisations, and it was just a very rich experience. And we were hosted there by a local activist organisation called Plus-Minus Art Residency, and they were actually their organisation was housed in an old Soviet chess club. So it was very DIY, and in that chess club they had what they called an archive of deindustrialization. And that archive was made up of objects that people in the community were collecting. It was mostly young people, I'd say, in their 20s, who were quite interested about the Soviet past, but not nostalgic for it, but kind of interested in kind of sort of picking through the rubble of this past to try and understand what this region had gone through and why it was in the place that it was in at this point in time. And so a big part of their practice at Plus-Minus was to go to abandoned, derelict buildings and to collect sort of objects that had been discarded there as historical trash, and to bring them back to this archive of deindustrialization, clean them, take care of them, make them into installations or use them in various kinds of unexpected ways. And so I had a chance to kind of hang out with them during the summer school and see this work that they were doing and think about that practice and actually kind of what it meant, and kind of try and theorize it as well in my work as kind of sort of guerrilla preservation, community preservation. But I wanted to read a passage from the last day of our visit. And there are two characters in it, Katya and Sasha. They might be online. And on the last day we went to one of these abandoned buildings, and we talked about the region and kind of the future of it. This was in the summer of 2019. On the last day of our visit, we take a trip to another well-loved local Zaporozhka. Zaporozhka is the word that was used to refer to derelict and abandoned buildings. The building is a so-called long build, one of the many construction projects abandoned in the 2000s due to bankruptcy or corruption, which had once been intended to house an IT hub and training centre for students and young specialists from the Azot factory and other industrial plants. Our group has agreed to meet on the roof of the building site, to drink beer and to take in the sunset. Crossing the building's threshold through a hole cut in the chain-link fence, we follow a makeshift path through the rubble that suggests the frequency of visitors to the site. We climb a set of concrete stairs that has come away from the wall and looks worryingly precarious, passing floors of heavily graffitied rooms that are now clearly well-used hangouts of local teenagers. On the roof, the most remarkable view awaits us. Bathed in late evening sunlight, the urban landscape of concrete high-rises ends abruptly, giving way to rolling forested steppe. Here, more than anywhere else in the city, one feels the utopian hubris of Soviet industrial modernity. Severodonetsk, the Soviet city of chemists, feels somehow stranded here, deep in the post-Soviet Ukrainian steppe. That night, as we sip our beers and watch the ebbing sunlight, I asked Sasha what he would like to see done with the region's many abandoned industrial buildings. Would he prefer them to be reanimated as part of a re-industrialized and economic thriving Donbas, or dismantled and cleared from sight, like the former steelworks of South Wales? He tells me that his dream would be for them to be adapted into community centres or art spaces, places where artists and activists, like those who gather at Shakhmatnaya, could continue to conduct their work. He talks about the derelict Belgian-built caustic soda factory in Lysychansk. Couldn't this become a community hub filled with co-working spaces, plants and smiling young creatives, like those you see in Warsaw or Berlin? But these dreams have no chance of being realised while the war's still raging on just hours away down the road. Who in their right mind, he asks, would invest in the region's derelict industrial architecture when it might any day be razed to the ground by an off-course Russian missile? Sasha had been more prescient than I'd realised that night. The Belgian-built industrial relics in Lysychansk, which had hosted all-night raves and dynamic activist festivals, attracting audiences from across Ukraine, were destroyed by Russian bombs in 2022. He sent me photos of the handsome red brick buildings in flames from the basement where he was sheltering, followed by images of Lysychansk's half-derelict oil refinery, which burnt for days, turning the sky black with huge plumes of dirty smoke, and the nitric acid plant in neighbouring Rubizhny, which following hits by Russian bombs sent mushroom clouds of toxic orange gases into the atmosphere. Severodonetsk was razed to the ground by Russian shelling, which hit the city repeatedly through the summer of 2022. The Ice Palace of Sport burnt down following a missile strike, its mosaics horribly charred. The activist community and their preservationist projects were pushed out of the city. Today, under Russian occupation, its history is being twisted in a different direction.
Thank you for that. I mean, this book has in itself, I feel like, a lot of very beautiful mentions of places that no longer exist. That's a really big part of it, right? That no longer exist for a very big reason, and that's the invasion, Russian missiles, and occupation. But I think there's still something about it which is it's a very beautiful way of remembering those places, because we can think of many ways in which there were certain things produced on, let's say, Mariupol, for example. I don't know if many of you have seen 20 Days in Mariupol, a very harsh documentary, but a very real and important documentary. But as important as it is, at times it's also super beautiful to see this kind of writing, which is not, perhaps as explicitly violent, yet it's real nonetheless, and it kind of really shows you and gets your attention to focus in on those places which were not visible and which are now even more invisible because of the missiles and the rubble. But I think, that was just something that I certainly thought of throughout. It's one of the only maybe resources where there is still this memory of those places and of those communities. Particularly for an English-speaking audience, we don't have really that many archives of the Ukrainian East that really tell you about these communities, about these beautiful kind of countercultural events or buildings that meant so much to everyone. But maybe if you could now say a little bit about the first chapter. It's entitled Mineral Worlds, and we weren't planning on this, but now I was just thinking about it. And it's very interesting how, throughout it, you really let the minerals guide you in a way. Like, I think this was something I was very surprised in when I picked up the book, because I wasn't expecting a first chapter of this sort. I really enjoyed it, but it was just very interesting how, you go with certain folks around these places and really you let the geological speak, and then through that you kind of unravel the different kind of layers of violence and layers of history. And I wanted to ask, why start this book in such a way? Why Mineral Worlds?
Oh, thanks, Lena. That's a really lovely question. Well, I suppose because, we started talking about the way in which this region is always perceived through the lens of kind of industry and now war. And there's sort of so many multiplicities to it that remain invisible, including this sort of way in which people lived in this sort of underground culture, but also like literal underground culture, right? So like what was underground. So the thing that people have always been after, these minerals, you know, you don't often actually encounter them in an embodied way. And I had the opportunity to meet a really inspiring person when I was doing this research, Mikhailo Kuleshov, who is undoubtedly the foremost historian of this region and has compiled an incredible archive of materials relating to the industrial history of Ukraine's east. And at the time he was originally from Orlivka, and he'd been displaced following the occupation in 2014 to Bakhmut. And he was based in Bakhmut, and he had an ecotourism firm which he was running with another friend. And I knew about him. I'd been following him for a long time. I was like a massive fan of what he was doing. And then when I went to Ukraine in 2021, I reached out to him and asked him if he would take me on some expeditions. And it was honestly the most remarkable thing you can imagine. So it was a really intense program because he wanted to show me everything. And we visited all of these places, kind of the oldest coal mine in the Donbas region, which is at that point in Toretsk, which was just 10 miles from the kind of contact line at that point. Salt mines, which if you've never been in a salt mine are really different from coal mines. They're these kind of cathedral-like, huge, cold, like incredibly beautiful, like sparkling, fairy tale-like places, but also part of this violent extractivist colonial history. And you can see why this kind of underground landscape is really bewitching for people, because you go beneath the ground and you encounter this other world that exists that, you know, is so desired by capitalists in order to make money, but has this just incredible sort of abstract beauty to it. And it contains all these multitudes from kind of deep time. So, you know, the salt is the seas that used to wash over this region, and all of the kind of creatures that used to exist in those seas that then became fossils and then kind of over millennia created this salt. So it's totally fascinating when thinking about how those layers and layers of history build up that led to the kind of colonial extractivist desire to mine this region for profit, like what histories are contained, what multitudes are contained in that. So I think I like a lot of other people, became really bewitched by these underground worlds, these kind of mineral deposits that like have drawn people always to this region. And I wanted to paint that partly because I think the book, you said it kind of captures this sort of different vision of the region from you know, what's being captured now in the media gaze. But I see it also as part of this broader kind of collective documentary initiative. A lot of people who've been displaced from that region now are also involved in various kinds of archiving and documentary projects to try and preserve that history and heritage and to kind of make it visible for audiences and people. And so I felt like it was also important at a time when, you know, all of these places were being destroyed, and with the destruction of the places, you also have the kind of the mines and the kind of industrial infrastructures are also compromised, so they get flooded and then sinkholes open up. So this is also part of history of the landscape and cultural history which is disappearing. I wanted to paint that as well and to try and bring that to people, so that kind of was the thinking behind that chapter.
And I think like industrial infrastructures are very important for the book as well, right? They're all around you in a way when you read this. And I guess because we still do have quite a bit of time before questions open up, I'm going to ask another one. You know, I do quite a bit of work around kind of Mariupol, particularly when it comes to like the visuality that's produced by the occupying actors. I'm very interested in those images, but if we go to the chapter Pink Skies, which kind of, you know, really paints a very beautiful picture of Mariupol a picture which cannot be painted again currently. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to paint similar pictures, but it's been absolutely scorched and reconstructed into something that looks absolutely different. But you know, there's this beautiful part about toxic commoning, how you know, how so many people within kind of these very toxic environments, that the heavy industry, which had absolutely no kind of regulations placed on it due to the oligarchic kind of ownership, but in general how they still persist and how they make this environment, which is extremely hostile and toxic, their own, and a place of almost, you know, refuge, rest, maybe commoning, sociality. So it would be interesting to hear particularly about this when it comes to Mariupol, because yeah, that's not something that many people think of when they think of, you know, water by a giant factory that never stops working. How can that be a place where people, you know, meet?
Yeah, thank you. Well, maybe just to say a couple of words about Mariupol for people who don't know the kind of pre-2022 history of the city very well. Mariupol was a city with two really enormous steelworks in it. Ebervale, close to where I'm from, had the biggest steelworks in Europe up until the end of the 19th century, and the accounts of the pollution there are kind of staggering. But Mariupol had two steelworks of that size in the city. So it was incredibly heavily polluted, and the steelworks dominated the whole place. So when I got off the train in November 2021, when I visited, you could immediately smell the coking ovens, like it was the first thing that you noticed. And that smell kind of didn't really go away. It kind of like lessened and increased depending on the kind of how the wind was blowing the smoke. But there were moments when like this black smoke, this smog would cover the whole city. And you know, my friends and colleagues who I was meeting with there would say, come on, get back in the car, let's move to another part of the city. So it was a really heavily polluted city. But also the factory was very present in a social and cultural sense all across the city, partly because of this way in which Soviet industries were established not just as places for employment, but as provisioning centres. Factories would build schools, they would build cultural centres, they would develop the public transport infrastructure. So they were involved in all aspects of cultural life in a city, and it was hard to be kind of employed or to be active in a way that didn't somehow involve the factory. And that was one of the first things that a friend of mine told me when we arrived in Mariupol. She was like, nobody here works outside of the factory, everyone is in some way connected with the factory. So the factory really dominated there. And the passage of the book that you're referring to is a kind of vignette from a trip that I did at night with this really remarkable guy called Artem, who was a steel worker, and he worked in the factory. And I think that was a really interesting thing, to encounter people who like worked in this industry and who were proud of having worked in this industry several generations, but also fully aware of how toxic it was and how polluted it was, and how you could hold that cognitive dissonance of being part of this sort of this enterprise which was toxic, which had a colonial history, that was extractivist and you know, profiteering, but it could also be value forming, community forming, and be an integral part of your own identity and sense of self. That was something I think that was really important for me to get my head around, how it could be both things at the same time. So he was a steel worker, but he was also a super keen photographer. I'll actually, maybe if we've got time, I can read the excerpt. And he took me on this really remarkable nighttime trip to photograph the factory, because he loved photographing the factory. It's a love-hate thing. Like, he thought it was incredibly apocalyptic, but also beautiful. So he had all these spots in the city that he liked to photograph from. And so we went in the car and we stopped in all these spots and photographed the factory. I took rubbish photographs, he took amazing photographs. And he told me about like what it was like to work in the factory and how things were changing and so on. And then right at the end of that, that little nighttime excursion, we stopped at the gates of Azovstal, and people who were just off their shift were in waders in the river, fishing at this point where the water was warmer because the wastewater from the factory was ejected there, and so it brought the fish into the shore, and so people knew that you could catch fish really easily. And it was water that was heavily polluted, and people knew that, but it was also an easy catch, and people couldn't resist that. So after their shift, a lot of people would get into the water there, and we photographed them too, and he was kind of really amused by this whole scene. And there was also signs everywhere saying, "Don't fish in this water," which is also kind of comical. But maybe I can just read that little bit about Artem. He also had a fish shop, like an aquarium. I meet Artem at his aquarium store on a bustling shopping street in central Mariupol. A friend has told me that he's a pillar of the local environmentalist community and will be able to tell me more about the industry-related ecological issues that the city is currently facing. He's chatting to a customer about the latest filtration equipment when I arrive and gestures to me that he won't be long. While I wait, I wander around the exhibitions of fish tanks. Artem makes biotopes, replicas of underwater habitats from around the world, which he enters into competitions. The habitats are works of great skill that involve sourcing difficult-to-find, regionally specific plants and creatures that are then assembled into curated scenes. The aquariums on display include perfect reproductions of the rocky bottom of Lake Malawi, populated by brightly coloured cichlids, and shell-lined base of Lake Tanganyika in Zongwe, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Alongside these exotic underwater seascapes is an aquatic habitat closer to home, the sandy ridges of the Kalchik River that flows around the northern outskirts of Mariupol's hyper-polluting Azovstal plant. Artem finishes with his customer and begins to tell me about his work. Like many Mariupol men, he first presents like an off-duty soldier, with closely cropped hair, camouflage jacket, and serious expression, suggesting military training and discipline. As I express my enthusiasm for his curated aquariums, however, his expression and stance change and I get a totally different impression of him. Artem is clearly a specialist who's learned his trade firsthand, up to his knees in local rivers and estuaries, but he's also disarmingly, endearingly funny, talking passionately about his love of fishing, which he inherited from his grandfather, who, like him, fished in his spare time when he wasn't working at the steelworks. I can understand how he's become a cult figure in the local community. His single-minded passion is infectious, and he can't wait to share his knowledge. In recent years, Artem has been successfully applying for small grants to support his biotope building project, and now has a club of fish enthusiasts who gather regularly at his shop. He mentors young people interested in marine biology and supports them to make replica habitats of their own. Many of the enthusiasts in his community are fishermen themselves, he explains, and so the club doubles up as a discussion forum for exchanging information about water pollution and local ecosystems. In a city where this kind of information is strictly controlled, this fishing club is one of the most expert committees able to determine the damage being wreaked to Mariupol's environmental landscape. Artem tells me that he's preparing a larger grant application to support his work testing and monitoring the city's water quality. These plants, however, will never come to fruition in Mariupol, as the Russian invasion will displace Artem and his community of activists just months later. Artem has an additional hobby that competes for his time: photography. He suggests that we meet later the same evening to drive around the city and visit some of his favourite industrial spots in Mariupol. Alongside his biotope building club, he's part of an amateur photography collective that meets monthly to view slides of each other's shows and cheerfully critique each other's work. For Artem, who has for several decades worked at the Illich factory and in recent years as a workshop manager, the metallurgy plants are a favourite theme. He particularly likes to photograph the factories at night, when the electric reds and oranges from the furnaces make them look their most dramatic. If you catch it at the right time and the sun's setting behind them, the red spread out against the sky and it's almost unbearably post-apocalyptic, he says, chuckling. Later that night, as we drive to a distant spot on the bank of the River Kalchik, from where you get one of the best views of Azovstal, Artem parks his car and points to a vaguely trampled track for me to follow through the brown, brittle reeds. I begin to walk into the darkness, guided only by the light of the factory on the other side of the river. I experience a brief sense of panic as I imagine myself lost in this confusing marshland before Artem catches up and sets me back on the right path. After walking into the pitch black for some minutes, we exit the reedy maze and Artem finds a fishing shack facing the factory. The contrast between the pastoral setting of this rickety wooden hut, filled with handmade benches for fishermen, and the awesome might of Azovstal across the water is staggering. So close to the factory, the air is filled with the sound of clanging metal and the oceanic roar of the blast furnaces, intermixed with calls of nighttime birds and splashing. Artem tells me that Azovstal has never stopped working. If the furnaces were to idle, they would quickly harden into a huge mass of solid iron that would be impossible to restore. Even during World War II, and then 2014, when the city was briefly occupied by Russian military and Russian-backed fighting groups, the blast furnace continued to operate. It would take Russia's months-long siege in spring of 2022, when bombs rained down on the city, seemingly without end, to finally extinguish their eternal flames. Before we leave the shack, Artem hands me a fishing float that he's found underneath a bench. The red bauble fed through with twisted chicken wire makes me imagine the fishermen who come here to pursue their favourite hobby. Back in Scotland, thinking back to that nighttime exhibition, I hold this float in my hand and wonder how many of those fishermen are still there now in occupied Mariupol. What do they think about as they look across the river at the now ruined steel mill that once dominated their city?
And I think on that note, we're gonna start taking questions from you folks, so we make it a bit more of a communal experience, because we've been talking at each other for a while now. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, comments, anything which maybe this discussion has brought up or which you had coming into this space, we would love to hear them.
You discussed about writing about the places that no longer exist and expressing care and sorrow for them, and how did this process of writing to the point of displacement of the community that you worked with and the absence of those places where you experience the things that you talk about. Can you talk a bit more about how that informed your research and generally the approach in writing this book?
How the displacement of those people and the destruction of the places? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So when
Would it be possible to repeat the question? Sorry.
yeah, of course, I can repeat it. So I think the question was about how this process of destruction, besides kind of erasure and the displacement of communities, impacted the research process. Yeah. So I was actually writing quite a different book when the full-scale invasion happened. It was much more of a kind of traditional academic history, albeit with kind of elements of experimentation in it, but it was a much straighter history. And then I just found I was very shaken, like everybody with friends and family in Ukraine, obviously not as much as my Ukrainian friends who experienced that sort of in the most intimate way, but still. And I found I just couldn't continue to write it in the way that I was writing it. It just felt too detached. And I was writing about the history of places that were at the time of writing being destroyed, and about people who were at the time of writing being displaced, and it just didn't feel ethically right. So I had to kind of pause the whole thing for a long time and went to sort of a different collaborative project. I had colleagues in Ukraine with work that they wanted to do, archiving testimonies from the war, and kind of didn't go back to it for about 4 months. And then when I did go back to it, I felt like I wanted to write in a much more emotionally informed way and to put myself in it, and kind of talk about the encounters that I had with people, and try and write something almost in conversation with people that would be much more intimate, but would also kind of reflect my emotional state, which was angry and sad and rageful and frustrated, and try and bring some of that into the book as well, because it didn't feel like it was appropriate to write with that sort of artificial academic voice from nowhere about this thing that was just sort of I was experiencing in such a kind of embodied way at that point in time, and I could see was impacting all of my friends and colleagues, so in the most horrific of ways. So I think it totally transformed the kind of the nature of the research. if research is even the right way, the kind of the voice that I use to convey or to communicate that research. But that said, you know, the book is still really research rich. It's got all of that kind of archival knowledge, all of that sort of reading in it. It's not as heavily footnoted as a traditional academic book would be, but I definitely consider it to be research informed. And you know, something that Vlad has sort of touched on, but we didn't really get into, was I was very conscious that I should write this in a way that was that would be welcomed by the people that I was writing about. So I knew that I had to share all the writing with them. And I wrote it in a way that I felt was kind of, to get academic for a moment, like the indigenous scholar Eve Tuck would call it desire sort of driven research, rather than kind of, you know, doing this sort of academic pirouetting where you're trying to say clever things and make kind of theoretical sort of frameworks for things. So I tried to write research that I knew would be wanted by the people that I was writing about, and I shared it, which is a thing that academics don't always do, because it's a thing that kind of exposes you to vulnerability in a way that we don't always like to be exposed. I shared it, and I invited feedback, and like not just on the level of fact checking, but on the level of like, am I exoticizing things? You know, tell me if this is an accurate sort of representation of you and the things that we did together in this place. And so in that way, I think it was sort of co-produced in a way, although obviously it's me who's writing it ultimately. So yeah, in those ways it did really impact, of course.
Yeah, and about that, just to say a bit more on that, I think like if you'll read the book, you'll see that kind of every chapter has at the very beginning a note from a person who is very important to this chapter. So like it kind of, before anything that Victoria says, I think there is kind of either a really dear Ukrainian friend or a person who kind of guided her throughout the places where she is. Like they kind of set the tone for the chapter, which is also very interesting. But I think we'll get to reading that in a second to kind of finish up the evening. But before that, please, if you have more questions, it would be lovely to hear. Wait.
Were there any underground or like countercultural events in the region that you went to that kind of took you by surprise? If something comes to memory right now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we went to a rave in Donetsk, which the like people who were hosting us were really clearly very amused about, that they would take these academics to a rave and like make them kind of dance and so on. So that was, but that was really amazing, because somebody's, one of the activists in the city, it was their birthday, and so they organised this rave, and you know, I'm sure you know, this region was quite well known for its like rave culture, and so people had travelled from all over Ukraine to come to this rave, and including, I was told later, from the occupied territories, people came across that line and attended. And so it was really like a remarkable thing to see this kind of solidarity and the way in which this region was like such a hub of cool culture that people really wanted to be a part of. And I suppose, so that stands out in this memory, because it was just it was an old hangar that they'd like rented from this pensioner owner for like very little money. They decked it out in like amazing fairy lights and like brought cinema seating in, and it was just a very like beautiful thing, and there were lots of shadows. The most amazing thing was Donetsk was a chemical producing city. They'd done a light show with elements from the periodic table on the wall of this hangar, and it was just like, whoa, amazing. And I remember actually, I wrote about it in the book, kind of like going into one of the back rooms, which would have been at some point, I suppose, like an office for the people who worked there. And there were lots of things left in this office from kind of, God knows, like 10 years ago or something. There were icons and like a map of the Azot plant, and just these odd things that had just been abandoned in there. And then through the window, the strobe lighting and the rave music, and it was this really intense kind of experience of the past and the present. and like this very kind of beautiful sort of blending of temporalities and histories and all of that kind of thing together, which is totally enchanting. And I think other colleagues, anthropologists, I'm thinking of Anna Balash's work. She's talked about enchantment and how enchantment was a big part of like this cultural life in Eastern Ukraine, and like these magical places and these magical happenings that kind of have this power. And I think you can sort of look at it in an anthropological sense about how the precarity there creates these conditions where you can have these really intense experiences, and the kind of derelict landscape, which has this really like ambient mood to it, can create this kind of context for like a different kind of dwelling and being. And she writes about that really beautifully in her work. And yeah, so in that way, like experiencing that rave with like all of the different sensations, I think had a really like profound impact on me. Yeah.
Well, we have like 4 more minutes for questions. There you go. Well, so the question was, will there be an audio version of the book by any chance?
Thank you. I'm not sure, but maybe you should narrate it. Thanks. I mean, it's kind of not up to me, but I'd love it, of course. Yeah. So it'd be an amazing thing if there were an audio version made. So thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, it's a more social question. You must have had lots of discussions about the Russian invasion. What were the attitudes? Were there any significant difference between the attitudes of Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers? Although I understand everybody speaks both. So it's not quite such a clear division. Because those of us on the left are confronted all the time by the likes of Putin, Trump, and their cult followers in the UK and in Scotland, who insist that everyone is pro-Russian, or at least these are Russian regions, and the division which is currently being attempted to be carved out is are justified. This is not me, don't worry.
No, I understand. Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think it's really important now more than ever to like dispel that myth. And I think it's one of the things that it indicates how successful Russian propaganda has been, like globally, that this like region has been understood as kind of Russian speaking, incurably Sovietized, kind of sort of a hopeless case in terms of integration into Europe and so on. That's I think a very important sort of way in which Russian propaganda has kind of framed the discourse around it. And I think in the book what I've tried to do is show how this region was at the intersection of different empires, and these entangled empires brought sort of kind of communities from all parts of the Russian Empire and from kind of Western Europe and from lots of different places, creating this incredible sort of multinationalism, multilingualism, multiculturalism, which was like at the very core of the identity of that region until like its destruction in 2022. And then industry as well, as we know from kind of the history of industrialization in the UK, that also brings waves of migration with it. And so, people came from all parts. So it was a very kind of complex, very diverse place that was so far from being monolingual, monocultural, mononational, quite the opposite, really. And I think then the other thing to understand is that after 2014, the beginning of the kind of Russian military operation in eastern Ukraine really radicalized people in this region against Russia because of the proximity of the war, the fact that the war was ruining like the potential for any kind of really real future, that it was compromising economies, that it was disallowing for any kind of meaningful investment that would bring about any sort of development, like I talked about in that chapter with Sasha, who really yearned for the development of this place so that it could be like Warsaw or something else. But because of Russia's war that was ongoing and everybody understood it was Russia's war, that couldn't happen. And so young people were really angry about that. And, you know, I think quite the opposite. They were like sort of really, you know, radicalized against Russia rather than being pro-Russian in any way. So I think, you know, it's really important for us to be very aware of the way in which Russian propaganda has sort of framed the way in which we understand this region, and to kind of really dig into this much more complicated history, which is entangled. It's not straightforwardly kind of Ukrainian nationalist either. It's like an entangled history with lots of different cultural influences and political influences in it, which is essentially what Mary Pratt would call a contact zone, an imperial contact zone, where lots of things intersect and you get this hybridity. And that, I think, is really fundamental, I think, for understanding that place and its cultural identity. And yeah.
I think you said everything, pretty well. And I think we can continue this discussion later on. I'm just kind of conscious of the time. And we wanted to end this evening on a kind of little bit of a special note. But before I go on about that, today, for example, was a very fucked up day, to say the least, for many folks in Ukraine. It was an extremely horrifying experience, one of the worst for many in Kyiv, for example. So I do just want to ask everyone again to, if you can, either donate to the fundraiser, which we will be sharing, or do get those prints, because again, we're in massive need of all kinds of aid, whether it be military, humanitarian, medical, whatever, particularly right now. But to end on a different note, am I thinking of the right note? Is this what we agreed on? Or maybe not reading? Yeah, good. Okay. Yep. Okay, so what we do all the time with kind of Dvika presentations, where when we were doing our fundraising tour, so to say, when Queer Ukraine just came out, we would do a lot of collective reading, because I think it's one of the most beautiful things you can do when a new book comes out and there's people you've never met. Like, to read the work together, it really, you get to know the work like nothing else really, and the space. And anyhow, so this is kind of what we wanted to try to finish on a collective note. We've been chatting a lot, but it would be really good to kind of read out one of the notes which I spoke of, which precedes chapter, which is the chapter on the cultural front, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the person who wrote it, and then basically what we're going to do is we're going to pass one book, we're going to pass a microphone, and it would be great if we could just read it line by line, but before that, maybe.
Yeah, so this note is by Angelina Rozhkova, who was the director, still is the director of the Pokrovsk Local History Museum. And the Pokrovsk Local History Museum was the place that hosted us for the second summer school that we did in 2021. And Angelina is a really inspirational community leader who was doing brilliant projects in Pokrovsk, working with local activists and artists to kind of dig into the history of this mining city, which is now, I think, at the very center of Russia's violence. So it's being bombed relentlessly for weeks and months, I think. And actually recently I saw that the museum that we'd had the summer school in had been hit by a bomb and had been destroyed. Luckily she'd evacuated the collection beforehand, and she herself has evacuated to Dnipro. But she's a really remarkable person, and in this note, she wrote this note when she was still living in Pokrovsk, and she stayed in Pokrovsk until the order was issued that everybody had to leave. And I asked her about her reasons for staying there, and she said that it was because somebody needed to stay to kind of look after the cultural heritage of this place and look after the communities, and that cultural heritage belonged in the place that it made sense in, and so she was going to stay there. And so she wrote this note about her work in the museum. It's really powerful because it also contains her hopes for the future, and they remain kind of very important hopes for the future, and I think many of us share them too. So yeah, we invite you just to read a sentence of it each and then pass it along and show where you are. There are some Ukrainian words in it, so don't worry about like pronunciation. I also stumble over pronunciation all of the time, so it's definitely not a big deal. Yeah, so thanks for taking part in it.
This book maybe, because this one's the old one, so I'm not sure if it's gonna be, yeah, I'm sorry. Who wants to start? Would you be okay with starting? And again, if you don't want to read, just pass the microphone along, that's completely fine. But if you do, then just get the book, get the microphone, and just line by line.
The local history museum houses many objects that were discovered on this territory, from the era of the pits and the catacombs to the Scythian, Samarian cultures and the Cossack times. Standing next to these exhibits, you feel a deep connection with past generations of people who inhabited these lands. This is surely one of the reasons why it's so important to visit local history museums, to experience that connection.
Our museum is also a resource for building society.
After all, the future has to be built on firm historical and cultural foundations.
Unfortunately, our museum space is currently closed to visitors, and most of our exhibitions have been evacuated to safer places separated from the country whose history and culture they commemorate.
Since the full-scale Russian invasion began on 24th of February 2022, my life, like the lives of hundreds of thousands of other people, has been divided into before and after.
Uncertainty, fear for our children, displacement, explosions. My fellow Ukrainians have had to learn to live with all of these things.
And that's without even getting into how a person should feel who has defended their country from Russian aggression with a weapon in their hands.
Or win from Russia, or who has lost a loved one in the war, or has been left with a disability.
Today we are all traumatized by the war, especially those who have seen it up close.
War is surely the most terrible thing humanity ever invented, and yet diplomacy and civilization, and these are relative concepts for me now, have not yet found a way to stop it.
I dream about people returning, buildings being rebuilt, culture being restored, along with education, transport, factories, and steep ecosystems.
I dream about my native land, triumphing over its external aggressors and its internal problems.
And I hope that this evil will not go unpunished, and that Ukrainians will know once more what it means to be happy.
And it ends there. I'm so sorry for those who didn't get to read it, but pick up a book and yeah. But on that note, yeah, I guess we want to thank you for coming to this presentation on the day of the publication and on the day of such a wonderful day as the 8th birthday of this wonderful bookshop, which we all should support more. So yeah, we're gonna run, I think, to the book signing little thingy.
I just also want to say that Queer Ukraine is going to be for sale as well next door, and Vlada and T, I think, are going to be there to sign it, so you can purchase both books. Yeah, so please do that.
Thank you.